dear colleagues, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event. And this event is embedded in the lecture series, as Florian already told you, and the lecture series of the Austrian Center for Digital Humanities and Cultural Heritage, the ACDH-CH at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And as director of this center and the institute, it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Dirk Hovy, our today's speaker from the Business University in Milan, Italy. We know each other from the University of Marburg and in Germany, where Dirk Hovy and he got an MA degree in linguistics there. And we spent some time together at the famous research center Deutscher Sprachatlas in Marburg some time ago during my PhD candidateship. So he did his PhD at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, working as research assistant at the Information Sciences Institute. And after that, he was a postdoc and also associate professor in Copenhagen at the University of Copenhagen. And since 2018, Dirk has been working as associate professor of computer science in the Department of Marketing at the Milan University. His research focus, closely connected to the topic of his talk, is on the interaction between language, society, and machine learning. And something like, or questions like, what language can tell us about society and what computers can tell us about language. So his profile might best be labeled as computational social science, and his talk today is maybe more in the context of computational social linguistics. He has authored over 70 publications, and a recent book, just to mention it, is on text analysis in Python for social science research. Also very important to mention, he recently received an ERC starting grant, congratulations, for a project on demographic factors and bias in NLP models. And outside of work, Dirk enjoys cooking, running, and leather crafting. Very interesting, ja. Lieber Dirk, ich freue mich sehr, dass wir dich heute hier haben in unserer Lecture Series und gebe dir das Wort. Und es wird heute um Kühlschränke gehen. Ist nicht ganz passend zum Wetter, es ist ein bisschen frisch. Ich freue mich sehr und du hast das Wort.
Danke dir, Alex. All right, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Time for me to switch to English and to turn on my screen. All right. So, yes, indeed, we know each other back in the day in Marburg, the famous or infamous Deutscher Sprachatlas. And actually this I was a master's student back then, and then I decided to do a PhD in natural language processing. I went to computer science. Now I sit at a business school in the marketing department. It's a wild story. We should talk about it over a beer. But the reason I'm here is actually closely connected to my background in Marburg, and what I'm talking about today, and also the ERC that Alex mentioned, is informed to some extent by that time. Coming out of this desire to basically connect computational methods and their use in big data with sort of the social aspects of language. And today I want to talk about a bit of a potpourri of different papers that I've worked on in this space and sort of give you a little bit of an overview. So I don't think I have to motivate this talk here too much. We all know that language carries all kinds of signal about socio-demographic aspects of us as speakers, probably most saliently for the layperson, local difference, so a regiolect, dialect in the widest sense. And we're very sensitive to picking up on these small variations and are then able to basically place somebody based on sometimes, very, very small phonological, morphological, or syntactic nuances. And these things are, oftentimes kind of gradations, slight variations of individual features in the language. It's essentially a gradient that we see across a geographic region. But sometimes, a lot of different features, a lot of different aspects come together to form like a completely different form. And then that basically, creates like an entirely different outlier. Now, if we know what the features are that we need to pay attention to, we can sort of find these gradients. Each of these gradients is like a particular feature of language that we pay attention to. Here we only have 2, and we can overlay these gradients to form a complex grid. And sometimes we get these bundles coming together of features that allow us to draw sort of like a line, a boundary where we say, okay, here a bunch of these features suddenly change really, from one town to the next. And we can then also observe how they change over time or don't change over time. And that gives us like a better understanding of the evolution of language and how language is distributed in space. So this is all fine and well. The question is, of course, where do we get this data from? Traditionally, we would have liked to have ortsfeste Sprecher, so stationary speakers who are well versed in the regional dialect, who haven't been traveling too much, who haven't been exposed to too many outside influences, and who can sort of give us a sense of what is sort of the base dialect in a region. The problem is, of course, that finding these people is more and more complicated in a more and more networked and connected world, and at the same time, it also involves a lot of work. I still, partially fondly, partially with horror, remember, all the hours spent over surveys and data, like the famous data that is stored at the Deutsche Sprachatlas. So an alternative today is social networks, right? So there's a lot of data on the internet that people voluntarily put there, more than we would think, more than sometimes we would want. And the question is, can we actually make use of this data? Can we draw some inference about how language is distributed in space and how it's changing over time? Or, are we still stuck with, having to manually interview and connect people, or is there a middle way of both, where we can get quantitative data in large amounts to get sort of a base impression, and then we can deepen this with qualitative research, doing interviews and more focused studies, and having a little bit the best of both worlds. And so the answer is kind of yes, I think we can have the best of both worlds. What I want to show today is a little bit an example of taking large amounts of social media data, and then without telling the algorithms beforehand what the features are that they should pay attention to, discovering the variation across space and between regions, between cities, between points in space, and to actually model and then also visualize how this language changes. I will talk a lot about a very straightforward method to actually do this, which has proved to be pretty valuable and also pretty flexible in showing a variety of things. And I want to give you a bit of an overview of that today. This is work that I've done with a couple of different people. First and foremost, Christoph Purschke, also an old friend from Deutsche Sprachatlas in Marburg, and like other than me, like an actual variational linguist, not just sort of a former one, a lapsed one. What you can see here on the left is basically already the peak of what's going to come. This is an image showing sort of in a visual way the linguistic differences, the variation between different cities in the German-speaking area in Europe, visualized as different colors, where sort of the same color or similar colors mean similar linguistic expressions, and different colors obviously mean different varieties. So how do we get there? That's the rest of this talk. So talking about similarities, I want to use the technique I introduced to show 3 different things we can ask. So one is, how similar are individual words to each other? How similar is their use in in the area that we're investigating. And then how similar are individual expressions, individual words to particular areas. And last but not least, how similar are different areas, different cities to each other? How similar or how different? So similar should, not only mean same, but can also mean how different. So we basically have a lexical level, we have a lexicospatial level, and we have a geographic level. All of this is based on a relatively simple intuition, and basically that words will mean similar things if they occur in similar contexts. And it's kind of obligatory in NLP to show this quote by Firth whenever you state this. So the idea is relatively simplistic, right? If a word always occurs in the same context, then it should mean, as another word, then it should mean a similar thing. Now the question is, how is the context similar? Well, it's a recursive problem because the context is also words, so the same definition applies. So in traditional variational linguistic studies, we would sort of define particular features of words that we want to analyze, right? So the degree of rounding or unrounding, morphological features like inflections or maybe even syntactic, morphosyntactic features of those words. And if we sort of represent a word, an expression, as sort of this bundle of features, in technical terms, we say this is a vector, right? And so there we have the same thing in the description of phonemes, for example, where we have, sort of oftentimes minimal pairs that only vary in one dimension of the feature vector that describes them. The nice thing is, once we have things expressed as vectors, we can do all kinds of things with it. So computational science has been pretty active over the last few decades since it was invented, and it has come up with an array of techniques that can be thrown at vectors. So that allow us to do all kinds of analysis. So that's very handy. But we first need to find a way to get our words and then also our geographical points into this vector space. So how do we do that? So let's start by reviewing some of the basics of these vectors. If you already are familiar with basics of linear algebra, this is not going to be something new, so you can tune out for like the next 3 to 5 minutes. If not, I'm going to give you like a very broad intuitive overview of why we want these vectors. So essentially, we're going to work with a lot of text that comes from social media data, and we want to have words that mean similar things to have similar vector representations. So we want flats to mean roughly the same as apartments, so we want their vectors to be similar. Now, a vector is just a list of numbers. For example, if it's just 2 lists of numbers, we can actually graph it in this 2-dimensional space. It works up to 3 dimensions. After that, yeah, we cannot graph it anymore. So we have these 2 words here that are vectors in a 2-dimensional space. And we have another word which is a little bit further away because it means something else. And we can represent each word, we can describe each word as a 2-dimensional vectors as basically its position on the x and y axis, right? So we can say flats has the vectors 16.3 and 7.8. That describes the word flats. The same for apartments, and we can see they are, relatively close together in this space, in this 2-dimensional space. Whereas the word platypus kind of far away on both axes from the other 2 words. Now, okay, you might say, fine, so we have a vector that describes the words. What does that get us? I mean, sure, you can make this graph, but what is that good for? Well, in this graph, we can also kind of measure what the angle is between these vectors. And so this cosine similarity, the angle between these vectors, basically tells us how close together they are in space, right? So here for this, flats and apartments, it's relatively large, the similarity, it's 0.84, whereas for flats and platypus, it's relatively small. And so in this representation, we can use this single value to basically say how similar or different are words to each other. By the way, cosine similarity goes to -1 from +1 to -1, where -1 basically means these two words are complete opposites. They never occur together. And that allows us to do all kinds of interesting things. We can focus on one vector, for example, the gray one here, as a point in space. And then we can say, okay, let's look at the 5 nearest neighbors. We can basically just measure the similarity with each of these other points and then order them by their similarity. So the green one is the most similar to the one we're interested in, followed by the blue, the orange, and the red one, and the pink one. And the yellow one is not part of the 5 nearest ones. And we can, vary this also, say we only want to look at the top 3. There are all kinds of other interesting things we can do when words are represented as vectors. This has been shown recently. So there's also some kind of semantic knowledge in these fridge-based vectors that I'm going to show, where we can basically say, okay, if we take the word of king and we subtract everything that is similar to man, and then we add everything that is similar to woman, essentially we're using these vectors to go one way, then the other way, and then back. And then we're basically ending up at another point in space, and we can basically say, okay, what word has a representation, has a vector that is close to this? And it actually turns out that is queen. So these vectors that I'm going to present to you today, word embeddings, they have been shown to capture all kinds of interesting semantic properties of words. And what we will see is they not only capture semantic properties, they also capture socio-demographic properties or variational properties. Slight caveat here, if words always occur in the same context but have the opposite meaning, they might be close in vector space, even though they do mean different things. So anyway, the question is, how do we get these vectors, right? So, okay, I've shown you these vectors and I've said, okay, each of these words is a point in this 2-dimensional space. How did it end up there, right? What are those 2 axes? What are X and Y in that case? What do they describe, right? Well, turns out, rather than having to define what these axes do, we can actually let the computer figure out which words occur together frequently, and thereby move them together. And this is where the fridges come in. Essentially, what we're doing with this algorithm called word2vec, we put all of our words as little fridge magnets on a fridge randomly, and then we just pick 2 words on this fridge, and we say, have we ever seen these 2 words in a sentence together, or in a specific context, I should say, within, n words to the left and right of each other. And if yes, then we move them closer together on our fridge. And if not, we move them further apart on the fridge. Now, we do that again and again and again for each pair of words on our fridge in our corpus. And by doing so, we eventually reach a stable state where things have clustered together, have grouped together in certain ways that A, reflect the underlying idea, have these words been seen in a similar context or not, but where it's also reasonably stable, so it won't change much anymore. Now, on a fridge, again, we only have 2 dimensions, right? But in 2 dimensions, if we move 2 words further apart from each other, we're also changing the distance to all kinds of other words that are around it. Now, that's a little bit inconvenient. If we added another dimension, we could sort of keep the distance of one word to most of the other words and only move it in the 3rd dimension, and thereby sort of reflect that, yes, we want to move it further away from this particular one word, but not from these other words. Typically, what we do with this word2vec algorithm is we not only take 2 dimensions, we actually take a lot more. For example, 300 dimensions, which are impossible to visualize and really, really hard to imagine. An old trick, apparently, from computational science researchers is whenever somebody has a high dimensional space, you just imagine 3 dimensions and you say 300 and then imagine that that's what it is. So to visualize what this looks like, we kind of start out with words in our corpus randomly. Each of them is assigned a 300-dimensional random vector, right? We just randomly put them on the fridge, and then we just perform our check for each pair of words. Have I ever seen them within the same window of words in my corpus? And we let this go for a while, and at some point, sort of everything has moved around long enough for it to reach a kind of stable configuration, such as this. And you can already see, I mean, obviously this is a toy example, and I spent a lot of hours making it do this, but this is also what we get in real life. You can see that these sort of cluster together in, let's say, semantic fields. So each of these words now, after we're done with our algorithm, has a descriptor, has a two-dimensional, if we're using a fridge, two-dimensional vector that describes where this word sits. Neither of these two dimensions by itself means anything. So we have to interpret this vector holistically with respect to all the other words. And we can use this concept of cosine similarity to say how similar or different is this word from the other words, right? And like I said, we don't just have the X and Y position like on a fridge, we actually have something like 300 dimensions. So once we have done that, we can also add sort of special words. We can add labels to this space. For example, here, these would be sort of the different semantics, syntactic semantic types of these groups that are forming, but they can really be anything. So they can be cities, they can be regions, they can be the names of people who have uttered these words. We can project everybody into the same space and then look at the differences, not just between the words, but also between the cities, the people, the regions, whatever. So to recap, we take a corpus, we have a bunch of documents. Each document is labeled with the name of the place we have collected this document in, and we put all of this onto our gigantic fridge. We keep noodling things around on our fridge by saying, have I ever seen this together? We can play this with the words, but also with the names of the cities. For example, have I ever seen this word in the city? If yes, move them closer together. If not, move them further apart. And by the end, we have this gigantic matrix of vectors. We have a 300-dimensional vector that represents each city in our corpus and each word in our corpus. And now we can ask different questions. So we can compare the vectors of different cities. We can say, how similar are these cities to each other? Basically, what this vector captures is sort of the linguistic similarity of these two cities. Do they use the same words? Do they use the same expressions in those two cities? We can compare words to cities because we've moved them together in the same space. And so we can basically say how similar is a particular word to a particular city. If it's used there a lot, obviously similarity should be larger. If it's never used there, similarity should be very low. We can also use these large dimensional vectors to do a couple of things. We can, since they are vectors, apply all of these computational methods, classification models from machine learning, clustering models, visualization techniques, and we can basically learn a little bit about how our space is structured and what is going on in there. And last but not least, we can compare words to each other and we can say how similar are these words? What is the nearest neighbor to this particular word? And for example, also in a particular city. This might seem a little bit abstract and cryptic right now, so let's dive right in and actually look at what this means in practice. All right, this brings us to the first study with this gentleman, Christoph Purschke, who is now a professor at the University of Luxembourg, studying sort of the development of Luxembourgish. And we did this study together a while ago, looking at German Regiolects on social media. So what we did is we got data from a social media site, Yodel. We got 408 German-speaking cities. And we collected data from those cities, 2.3 million conversation threads, which are about 17 million individual messages. Now, Yodel works in a way that everything is anonymous. You don't know who you're talking to. You only know that they're within, I believe, a 10-kilometer radius around you. So it is very localized, so actually perfect for what we are interested in, namely, do people on social media, when they are anonymous, actually still perform sort of regional identity by the way they express themselves or not? They say on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. But on the internet, does it matter whether people know you're from Munich or from Hamburg or from Vienna or from Zurich? Well, that's what we're going to find out. So we're basically taking all of this data and we're putting it into a large corpus. One thing we did is we actually removed any words we could find using an algorithm that basically looks at named entities. So the names of people, the names of places, the names of companies, because it turns out when you are, for example, in Vienna, you are, whoops, Prater should not have an H in there. Well, this is the old German spelling. Turns out if you are in a particular place, you talk about that place much more. So if you're in Vienna, you talk about Vienna much more than somebody who's not in Vienna. And we're actually not interested in learning sort of regional topics. We're actually interested in learning sort of regional language use. So what we're doing is we're excluding all of these regional terms as far as we can catch them with these stochastic machine learning tools that are trying to identify people, places, and names of sports teams and other things that we know are highly regionalized, but that actually don't tell us a lot about language use. So after we've done that, we do the whole 300-dimensional fridge thing. We throw the names of our cities onto a large 300-dimensional fridge. We throw all the words onto that fridge in our corpus, all of the 16.8 million messages with all the, I don't know how many million words. And we sort of move all of these words and the cities around based on have I ever observed these two together. And this leaves us, for example, with the representations, the 300-dimensional vector representations of those 408 cities in the German-speaking area. What we can do now with this matrix of representations is a couple of things. One of them is visualization. Now, 300 dimensions, again, very, very hard to think about, even harder to visualize. So what we're going to do is we are going to reduce the dimensions. We're using a technique called non-negative matrix factorization, where we basically say, okay, what we see, these 300-dimensional vectors really are the result of multiplying together these two matrices that only have 3 dimensions. One of them, which we call H, we can actually throw away. We're not interested in that one. We're only interested in this one. So now we've basically represented each city as a 3-dimensional vector. Okay, great. What does that get us? Well, it actually gets us that we can interpret the first value in this 3-dimensional vector as the amount of red in that city, the second value as the amount of green, and the third vector value in the vector as the amount of blue in that city. So this is an RGB value, and if we take RGB values together, for example, if you have 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, that is a nice medium gray. If you have 0, 0, 0, that is black. If you have 1, 1, 1, that is white. And we can express pretty much any color in between as a triple of these colors. So we've taken our learned linguistic representations of the cities, where we assume cities that have similar expressions, similar ways of using language, have similar 300-dimensional vectors. And we've reduced these vectors to 3 dimensions. And we're now going to interpret those 3 dimensions as color values. So now we can take these color values and we can put them on a map of the German-speaking area, giving each city the color that we have computed in this way. And we know where they are in geographical space so that we don't have to compute. And we're going to vary the size by the number of data points we have from that city. And that basically gives us this map. And if you look at this, you will notice a couple of nice aspects of this map. So this is really what the map came out at first try. I remember sitting there at 1 in the morning, running the computation and saying, okay, let's just see what comes out of it. And this is what we saw. And it was actually very exciting because you can already tell that this has captured some things we are familiar with from variational linguistics. We see sort of the different dialectal areas. We see that there is a clear difference between northern Germany and southern Germany. We see that there is a gradient in general between these different data points. But we see, for example, that sort of the upper German, the varieties in southern Germany and Austria are much closer together than in color than they are with the northern German variants. We also see that Switzerland here is like this completely separate entity, right? Everything in Switzerland is green, as opposed to sort of the bluish or reddish hues that we see in Austria and in Germany. If we actually zoom further in, we can also see that the French-speaking Swiss area has like a slightly different type of green, meaning this is sort of like separated out even more. And as we zoom in more, we will actually see that these things hold down to like the city level, even like cities that are right next to each other will be distinguished fairly precisely by this method. So this is one of the first things we can do. If we've managed to transform all of our cities based on the language that is used there on social media into a 300-dimensional vector by putting it on a fridge and then moving things around, we can then visualize this by giving each city a specific color, and that color reflects sort of the linguistic repertoire in that city. So fairly neat. Okay, but is there more to it? I mean, this is a pretty map, but does it line up with linguistic theory? I mean, there's not much to it if it doesn't, other than making a nice wall decoration. So what we're trying to do is take this continuous map and discretize it to see how well it fits a map of the German dialects. Here we're only using German dialects because for that we had the data available in the right format that would allow us to actually measure this. So this is a map by Lameli of varieties of German, and we can, already by eyeballing this, see that, some of these things seem to line up relatively well. But relatively well, it doesn't cut it in computational science. We want a number to put on this. So let's put a number on it. All right. Remember, we took each of our cities and we represented them as a 300-dimensional vector based on the language use in that city. Well, we've visualized this, but another thing we can do is we can run clustering methods on our 300-dimensional vectors. So we're doing this using an algorithm called agglomerative clustering with certain parameter settings. It's often then also called word clustering. Essentially, each city starts out as its own cluster, and then iteratively we are merging cities together based on how similar their vector representations are to form a single cluster together, and then we form clusters together to form larger clusters, and so on and so forth, until we end up with only 2 clusters left. The nice thing is we can cut this cluster tree that we see here at any point and say, okay, which cities go together if we want 2 clusters, if we want 5 clusters, if we want 7 clusters, if we want 15 clusters. And then we can say, okay, let's color all the cities that are in the same cluster with the same color, and let's put that on the map, and then let's see how that fits with the boundaries that we know exist in the varieties of German. And you can see that this lines up reasonably well. But again, how well is reasonably well? Well, we'll see. One thing I would like to point out here is the curious case of Würzburg, which you can see sort of almost in the center of Germany, which is bright green. Yes, thank you. That is my local dialect coming through, which is bright green it should actually not be bright green. It should be purple, like the points that are to its right. But when we looked into it, it actually turns out that Würzburg has like a very large student population, largest, and the majority of those students come from actually other areas. They come from areas in the West, and they import sort of their language variety onto this platform, which we then measure. So here we sort of have like this interesting effect that, we're kind of measuring migration in this data. We're doing one more thing to this data, which is a little bit more technical, so I don't want to go too much into it. It's a technique called retrofitting. So essentially, we have learned these 300-dimensional city representations by noodling words around on our gigantic fridge. We want to imbue these representations with a little bit of geographic information. So what we're doing is we are essentially taking the points of cities that are in the same NUTS region. NUTS is a European geographic statistical measure, which corresponds to things like Gemeinde, Bundesland, things like that. There are different levels of them. We use NUTS 2, which is a certain level of granularity. And we're basically saying, okay, we have the linguistic information of how similar two cities are based on our 300-dimensional fridge method, but we also want to ensure that things that are in the same NUTS 2 region are closer together than things that are not in the same region. So we're taking both the linguistic information we have and the geographic information that is given from the map to sort of arrive at a compromise. So we're moving things a little bit around. So you can see here the yellow and the orange are in the same NUTS 2 region. So we want to encourage them to be closer together and further apart from the blue point, which is in a different NUTS 2 area. And so when we do that, we can basically now say, okay, how well do these learned representations line up with the map of Lamelli, where we know what the areas are? There are two measures that we're using. One is homogeneity, where we basically say, are the points in one cluster, remember we're clustering our cities together, are the points of one cluster in only one geographic region? And if they are, then good. This is a high homogeneity score. This is a bad homogeneity score because the clusters, some points of the pink cluster actually happen to be in another region, at least one other region. And then we also look at completeness. That is kind of the inverse. We're looking at one of the regions on the map and we say, how many different clusters has our method put into this region? The top one is good. It only has put pink points into that region. The lower one is bad. Our method has put 3 different clusters into the same region. So that's not a good completeness score. And then essentially we're taking the average over these 2 measures, which is called the V-score, and that tells us how good did our clustering solution line up with what we know from variational linguistic theory of the distribution of regions in Germany. So here is sort of the original vector. If we only take the linguistic information, and if we add some geographic information to these vectors, we see that these scores go up. The best one we achieve is for 16 clusters, which reaches a V-score of 0.77. So you could say that our clustering solution sort of lines up with Lamelli's map by 70 to 77%. Or is correlated to 77%. It's not exactly correct to say it, but among us, let's just say that's what it means. It's the most intuitive interpretation. So what does that look like if we use these different clusters? So if we start out with 2 clusters, we get Switzerland versus everybody else. Very clear line. If we have 3 clusters, again, it separates out Switzerland. You can see there are some red dots. Those are on the German side of the border, and then the green ones are in the Swiss area. But it also starts to separate upper and lower German varieties you see red. Again, you see like Austria and southern Germany being in the same cluster versus sort of all of the north. And you can probably already, see like the Benrather linie kind of raising its head here a little bit. If we go up to 5 clusters, we get first more distinction in the southern variety. So in the upper German varieties, you can see that the west is kind of split into a blue and a green cluster. I'd like to draw your attention here to Mannheim and Karlsruhe. There is actually a line that runs through, and we can nicely see that these things line up on the right side of the border. Because some of the dots are a little bit larger, they kind of like bleed into the other side of the border, but it's like, drawn with a ruler. There is a line between these two areas, which roughly correspond to the Rhine-Main area and like, Rhine-Moselle, Franconian, and then maybe like a Swabian southwestern variant. If we go up to 10 clusters, we get even more distinction. Now also in Switzerland, we see in the southwest in blue, those are all the French-speaking areas. Then we have sort of a western south and western Swiss variety in purple, and then in green a northeastern variety. And then you can see here like the German varieties splitting up more. You can also see Austria now separated out from the upper German cluster. And again, you can see sort of like Donauschwäbisch. You can see in Augsburg, there's this red dot over all of these yellow ones. Again, there's a nice line between the two varieties. And we can also now start to see a slight distinction. This is a little bit hard to see here because it's like a spring green and a forest green. The northern varieties are also starting to be distinguished. And then with 16 clusters, which actually gave us the best similarity with the Lamelli map, this is sort of what we see. We kind of run out of 16 colors. So obviously Berlin and Karlsruhe do not have the same variety. These are slightly different colors, but because we're limited in the number of colors we can use, we sort of, see the same color in different parts of the map. And again, some of them are a little bit hard to distinguish. Unfortunately, there's not that much you can do. But this is sort of the maximum distinction our clustering can get us. And this corresponds or correlates to like 0.77% with the known map of at least German varieties. Can't speak to the Austrian and Swiss varieties. Okay. We can then, so this is the first part where we have projected our cities into this 300-dimensional space based on language use in those separate cities in an anonymous social media platform, Yodel, and we find that it still reflects enough of local distinction that we can sort of reverse engineer a map of the German dialect areas. Now, the other thing is we also projected all the words in our corpus into this 300-dimensional space. So we can compare words to the individual cities and we can find prototypes. What are the words that are most similar to the vector for Vienna, for example? Well, this is what they are. And if you look at them, these are the 10 most frequent words, obviously for visualization purposes, projected down to 2 dimensions. You can see here, so Vienna in yellow, and then all the words that are close to it in light blue or in aqua. You can see that, most of the closest words are actually dialect words that people write in a variety of ways, right? So Herst is like written in 2 different ways, for example. The other ones you can see, Jodel, Confession, Schwedenplatz, and Loco, those are sort of platform-specific expressions and also some regional locations which our filtering hasn't managed to catch and hasn't filtered out yet. But this is fairly encouraging because it allows us to understand a little bit of what's going on in these areas that we get. And so we can also aggregate these things by cluster. If we look at our 3-cluster solution and we check what are the most prototypical words, what are the 10 words closest to the centroids of these 3 different clusters, here is what we see. So we get a northern cluster, and these are all high German words, ja gut, erstmal, sieht, and so forth. Then we get a southern cluster, which has a lot of dialect words in there, dialect expressions. And then we have a Swiss cluster, which has Swiss German expressions. We can also look at the individual words and compare them to each other, and we can do things with those words. So doing things with words might be an alternative title for this talk. What we're doing is we're looking at the resources of the people on this platform, meaning what are the different stylistic resources they use. So here we have some examples, some words: gerne, einfach, add VG, city life, smiley, jamais, and möppes. Each of these words is a 300-dimensional vector in our model, right? So we have managed to turn a word into a 300-dimensional vector. None of the dimensions of this 300-dimensional vector by themselves mean anything, right? We cannot look at dimension 5 and say, ah, yes, this is morphosyntax, or, oh, this is rounding, or something like that. No, unfortunately, this does not directly correspond to any of these recognizable features of variational linguistics. But what we can do is use machine learning and a classification approach. And we can say, look, these words are represented as 300-dimensional vectors. We don't know what the individual dimensions mean, but I can tell you that this first word here is Standard German. Then we have a traditional dialect, Regiolect. Then we have expressions that are specific to the platform, to Yodel, at BJ, vorheriger Jodler. This is like referencing somebody else. There are interesting pragmatic studies that you can do to this, because there was a change during the time we collected, going from at BJ to like at 1, at 2, to basically refer to previous people. This is a separate study I won't talk about here. There are life world orientation terms. There are general terms of online communication, like smileys. There are foreign words, jamais, clearly here, French term in there. And then there are community-specific words. These used to be Regiolect dialect terms that have been co-opted in this community and sort of taken on a life on their own, which we talk about more in one of the papers. What we're doing is we selected around 2,000 words and labeled them by hand, told the computer, look, if you see this vector here, this 300 dimensions, that's a standard German term. If you see this one, this is a community-specific term. And then we essentially fed this into a classifier, very, very simple classifier, logistic regression with regularization. And then we train that classifier with it. We say, okay, I want you to make sense, learn how to interpret these 300 dimensions. So if I show you a new example, you tell me which of these different categories this word belongs to, right? Remember, we have a gigantic corpus of like 16.8 million posts with several dozens of millions of words in there. We labeled manually 2,000 of them, but we want to label all the rest of the, let's say 50 million words. No, not 50 million, 50, more like 50. I got to look up what it is, but it was like several dozens of tens of thousands of words. Too much for us to label, but we can use the power of machine learning to do that for us. And then once we've done that, we can aggregate those words by city, by region, by cluster, and we can see what is the distribution over these 7 different categories in those different regions, and are there any meaningful differences? So yes, there are. So if we aggregate by country, we can see, unsurprisingly, in Germany, the the ratio of standard German items is larger than in the other areas. The online communication items are roughly the same in all 3 countries. but there's a difference in the use of traditional regional items, much more in Switzerland, and again, sort of more than in Germany, in Austria, and very few in Germany. All the other categories, relatively similar, some differences with like use of foreign language words. If we aggregate by individual cities, we selected a couple of cities in the 3 different countries. We see sort of the things that we've observed at the country level. Again, interesting to point out here, the 3 German cities are somewhat similar. There isn't that much difference. There's slightly more dialect in Munich than in the other areas, but not that much. Interestingly, in Austria, in Vienna, there's a lot fewer traditional regional items used than in, say, Innsbruck and Linz. And again, in Switzerland, many more traditional regional items in use, in Bern even more than in Zurich. We can also look at the cluster solutions that we found. And again, we see sort of similar solutions here. We've labeled the different clusters that we found with sort of the German dialect areas, or with the dialect areas that they largely correspond to. And again, you can see that these resources differ very succinctly by different areas. We can also put those on the map, and we can sort of see, again, kind of what we expect. Standard German terms, much more prevalent in Germany, least prevalent in Switzerland, and sort of, you know, mixed in Austria, kind of sort of the inverse with the use of traditional dialect terms. We can do even more with these terms. So using the representations we have learned, we can actually look at an individual post and try to predict where this post comes from. So was this post written in Berlin? Was it written in Hamburg? Was it written in Linz? Was it written in Bern? And it turns out, even though we removed the most indicative localized terms, which, you know, would give us like an extra boost, we can sort of make an educated guess where something comes from. This was never the goal of it. We don't want to do a geolocation, which is the task of assigning a location to a social media post. But you can see, and this is the interesting part here, that in Germany, it's much harder to pin down where a post comes from. There's a much larger area that things can potentially emanate from. In Austria, it's smaller. In Switzerland, it is very small. We can pinpoint where somebody is from to a very large degree, meaning there's a much more granular distinction at a regional level than in Austria or in Germany. So this is the work I did with Christoph Purschke. The same idea can be extended to different social media terms. So this is a method. We now have a hammer, and now the whole world of social media and variational linguistic studies is our nail. So as a next nail, let's pick Twitter and, well, all of Europe and see what happens. This is joint work with some dear colleagues in Australia during a research stay there, and Julian Brook, who since has moved to the University of British Columbia in Canada. So essentially what we did is we had a collection of 50 million tweets from all over Europe. And here you can sort of see the density of where these tweets emanate from. Lots of tweeting in the UK, quite a bit in Spain and in France, some in Italy. Germany is already a lot sparser. The Netherlands are brightly covered. Everybody in the Netherlands seems to tweet. And then, you know, you get a large swath in Scandinavia and sort of as you go further east that are more sparsely covered. We're going to get around that issue though. What we want to do now is kind of the same we've done before. We sort of want to see whether we can learn regions, varieties in a data-driven manner just from how people talk on Twitter in these different areas. So in order to do that, we need to do one thing that's a little bit weird, but bear with me. Namely, if we have the phrase "Welcome to Hamburg," for example, "Willkommen in Hamburg," if we look at different languages, for example, Swedish and Danish, we as human speakers with our human eyes and human minds and some knowledge of how language works can look at this and go like, yeah, they're very, very close, right? There's a little bit of variation in there, but it's basically, mutually intelligible. And yes, Swedish and Danish are mutually intelligible. They just like to pretend it's not. But what a computer sees is basically just 6 different words, right? None of these have any overlap there. None of these words are the same as any of the other words. So to a computer, it has like word number 1, word number 2, and word number 3, which are in Swedish, and word number 4, 5, and 6, which are in Danish. So what do we do with that? No overlap between these two. Well, but we can see with our eyes that there should be overlap. What we do is we chop things up a little bit. Essentially, what we're doing is we're using an n-gram approach. We're using trigrams. So we're basically looking at 3 characters at a time, and we're dragging this little window of 3 characters over the corpus. And we extract those combinations of 3 characters, including spaces. So our Swedish message sort of becomes these 20, and our Danish message becomes these 19 trigrams. And if you look at those, you can see that there are actually a lot of them that occur in both, namely these 13 on either side. So here we have a pretty good overlap, actually like 2/3 of the message overlaps. So that's pretty neat. This allows us to capture regional variation and like language variation across national borders, but still capture similarities. What we're going to do is we're going to put a grid on our map, which I think we used like 1 minute degree length for each of these little cells. And then we extracted all of the tweets that had been sent from this particular cell. We would chop them into n-grams, and then we would use our 300-dimensional fridge method to learn representations of these trigrams. So here they are. Each of our large vocabulary of trigrams is now represented as its own 300-dimensional vector. And now we can pick a particular cell, and we can say, okay, which of our trigrams have we seen in there? We can subselect those, and then aggregate, just take the average of them, and say, okay, this 300-dimensional vector now represents this particular cell. One thing we do is we do sort of like a smoothing. We have some cells that are very well represented. There are a lot of tweets coming from the Netherlands, for example. There are some fewer the further east and north you go. So what we're doing is we're kind of averaging out. We're accounting for some interpolation between these different cells. So we say, okay, it's like a smoothing where we say, okay, we might not have observed as much in this area, but we can sort of use a little bit of the information from the surrounding cells to kind of represent what we see in this area. And this sort of leads to a smoothing effect, which also accounts for sparsity in the data to some extent. Again, we can do this thing that I've shown you before, where we take our 300-dimensional representation for each of these cells, capturing sort of the use of trigrams in this particular cell, and translate this into a color. Right? And so again, we can put we can associate a color to each cell on our map. And this is what it looks like. And the nice thing that comes out of this is that we see that, national varieties are clearly distinguished. We can see sort of the Romance languages all in sort of a bluish hue. We can see the Germanic languages in a brighter green color. Interestingly, English sort of goes with the Germanic languages more here, but we can also see interesting things like the bifurcation of Belgium. Right, we have the north in a greenish hue, which is the Flemish variety, and in the south we have Wallonian. So this is more of the bluish hue. We have 2 different colors or 3 even in Switzerland. And we have also the influence of Alto Adige, of the German-speaking area in the northeast of Italy. There are other things that pop out in this map. We see some odd behavior. So Russia stands out, and actually all the countries that are using Cyrillic alphabet, because that's what this sort of graph-based method picks up on. We see that Turkey is in a separate area, has like a nice bluish hue, so nicely separated from the rest. And again, also Greece here in a different format, largely because of the use of Greek letters in this area. All right. So what I'd like you to take away for this, and then I'm going to be here for all of your questions, is that we can learn dialect continua from social media. There is a rich variety of information out there in social media, which we can use to get a basic understanding. It does seem to align well with what we know as variational linguistic theory and known wisdom. There are a variety of computational methods that we can bring to bear. We can include a lot of other information like geographic information and other things that we happen to know that is not represented in the data in the corpus itself. And we can do a variety of visualization, clustering, and prediction analysis with the data that allow us to get a better insight into this vast swath of data and sort of make it manageable for then further analysis, which allows us to drill deep, kind of do an analysis of local differences, use of styles, resources, and other aspects of language. So I hope this has sort of whet your appetite a little bit. And thank you for your attention. I'm here for all of your questions, linguistics or computational related. Oh, all of this work is published in these different publications. The first one actually is this book that Alex mentioned initially, which, if you're interested in, I'm also happy to send you a draft copy. If you want to do the things I've shown in this task, you can. Python and the data is there for you.